So welcome, welcome, one and all. This is a special live show as part of the public programming for the States of Violence exhibition in collaboration between WikiLeaks and the Wow Holland Foundation. Please do take your time to look around at the artworks that we have here. And today we are joined by Stella Assange on my immediate left and Matt Kennard to talk about and delve into the intricacies of the Julian Assange case. To start with, Stella is a human rights lawyer who was born in South Africa. She joined Julian's legal team in 2011, and in March 2022, she married Julian, with whom she has 2 children, born in 2017 and 2019. Thank you for joining us, Stella. Please give a round of applause to Stella.
Thank you.
Our other guest for the show today is Matt Kennard. He is a chief investigator at Declassified UK. He was a fellow and then director at the Centre for Investigative Journalism in London. He's also the author of a new book called The Racket. No, the new book is called The Silent Coup. He's the author of the book The Racket, Irregular Army, and Silent Coup, How Corporations Overthrew Democracy. It will be launching with Apolitical in May 2023, alongside an exhibition featuring the artwork of his father, Peter Kennard, the prominent political artist in this country. Now, to start with, when thinking about this case of Julian and what he is facing, what he is suffering for the rights of us all, I'd just like to read one, two, one, two, one, two. Okay, that's a bit better. A quote from the Chartist Ernest Jones, who was sentenced to 2 years in prison for seditious speeches in 1848. Of course, the Chartists in this country were mobilizing for the right of people who were not landed gentry to have the right to vote for parliamentary representation. And Ernest Jones put it this way: because I tried to extend your liberties, mine were curtailed. Because I tried to rear the temple of freedom for you all, I was thrown into the cell of a felon's jail. Because I tried to give voice to truth, I was condemned to silence. And I feel that these words definitely apply to Julian's case. As Peter Gallison puts it in his book, Agnotology, the Making and Unmaking of Ignorance, the classified universe is certainly not smaller and is very probably much larger than the unclassified one. 2001, the year the war on terror began, you saw 33 million classified actions taken by the US government. And that year alone, the US spent $5.5 billion to keep those classified documents secure. So now we are in a situation where Britain, as an aircraft carrier for the US military, home to 12,000 US soldiers, is involved in the slow motion crucifixion of Julian Assange, keeping him in Belmarsh and cooperating with the United States on this plan to extradite him there and prosecute him under the Espionage Act. Of course, the Espionage Act came about in World War I specifically to deal with people that refused to fight in that war that killed around 20 million people. And the United States have made clear that they have the intention of sending Julian to prison for 175 years. So to start with, Stella, with yourself, how are you?
Well, I'm okay. Julian is fighting on. almost 4 years into his incarceration in Belmarsh prison. It will be 4 years on the 11th of April. And it's very difficult to describe the challenge of surviving, because it's basically surviving, when things are so open-ended and the stakes are so high. We're basically faced with the possibility of Julian being taken away from us forever. Never. Or him being free within, any time, when those in power come together and actually have a serious conversation about undoing the incredible harm that they're engaged in. And both of these possibilities coexist, and you kind of have to manage these two realities as best you can. And Julian's incredibly strong, and he manages as best he can, but just because he's managing, it doesn't mean it's easy. And I think some people maybe are familiar with Julian being, brilliant and extraordinary and all these things, and they forget that actually he's just a human being who struggles as well. So he's fighting, but he's also struggling.
The war on terror, we have seen across the last 20 years, the United States spending around $32 million per hour on leading this war. On average, 46 bombs dropped per day. We've seen the bombing of over 7 countries take place throughout this period. And on the flip side of this, you have this bid to make public information which pertains to these wars and is absolutely vital for the people in the countries that are waging the wars to actually have an understanding of what the implication of that is, the way in which their money is being spent. And on the other side of it, you have had this very close and personal view of some of the human cost which is being visited upon somebody in the City of London from the Ecuadorian embassy, which you have described as basically becoming a black site. Of course, the UN Special Rapporteur on Torture has deemed what has been visited upon Julian as a form of torture. And in the midst of all of this, you've been trying to raise a family. Now that in and of itself is hard enough under quote unquote normal circumstances. What has that struggle been like for you?
Well, it's a bit of you have to make it up as you go along, right? I mean, there is no charted course for how to deal with a situation like this. I think you just need to have your priorities straight. And my priorities are getting Julian out of prison and having a family, and that means getting the children to understand we're a family, understand that the situation is not normal, even though there is a routine of going to see Julian inside this prison and under very restrictive conditions and so on. And also trying to give the kids an indication of the bigger picture. So explaining that Julian is there being part of a huge injustice, but that it's an ongoing injustice that there's a struggle. There's an ongoing struggle that we're engaged in, that I'm engaged in. So if I have to go somewhere, it's because I'm doing it to fight for their father to come home. And that we're not alone, and that we have lots of people that support Julian's freedom. Because it's really important for me, for the kids to understand that that they don't internalize the injustice, you know, in their bones. That they feel that there are different forces that are confronted, and to simplify, good and bad, and that good is fighting for their father because their father represents good, their father represents a fight against injustice, their father represents truth and justice, really. So that's, you know, that's basically the approach that we have, and also not to lose sight of the goal. And I don't really like the word hope because I find it a little bit demobilizing, but that it's kind of an ongoing vision of where we have to be, and that's with Julian free.
Absolutely. Matt, now you have followed the process through the British courts of this case in quite a deep way. What do you think that, as far as you've seen, has said about the judicial process in this country, especially when it pertains to the interests of the US government?
Yeah, I mean, it says a lot, really. I mean, in terms of Julian, I think that he exposed, obviously, and is famous for exposing the most powerful empire in the world, and its military, diplomatic, imperial operations. But he also has done two other very useful things for anyone who's interested in democracy and freedom, which is expose the media, number one, the mainstream media, through doing his job and exposing war crimes and doing what a journalist, an honorable journalist, should do, and being brave enough to do it. He exposed the rest of the media, the real function that they perform, because he should be a hero in the media, but he's not, he's the opposite. And in fact, I'll just tell you a little anecdote because it's quite interesting. I was in Washington, DC, working for the Financial Times and going in and out of the White House in 2010 when the first cables were being released. And it was at that point that I really became disillusioned with the mainstream media, because I remember sitting in editorial meetings with senior journalists. One of them actually was called Stephanie Kirch-Gasser, who worked later for The Guardian. But the general feeling from senior journalists at the FT was that what Assange was doing was wrong. And it was it wasn't really qualified or conceptualized. It was just clearly that he was exposing power on a level that they thought was not what journalists should do. And then you saw that play out over the whole of the following years, you know, like he was instantly turned on by The Guardian particularly, and others. And it's partly it's jealousy, but it's also because he exposed what the media's function is, which is largely, I'd say 90% of the time, an arm of the state. And he was the opposite. So he exposed the media, he exposed the US empire, but finally, he exposed the British judiciary in a way that is, for me, maybe the scariest of all of them. Because we grow up and we're taught things in politics class, civics class, about how our society functions. One of the bedrocks of that is the independence of the judiciary. That the judiciary is independent from the executive, and it takes decisions which are in the interests of the law and the interests of the people, not in the interest of political power. Now, Julian Assange is playing at a level where all that theory and all that principle melts away. And it shows that the things we assume are solid are actually very, very flexible and can disintegrate very quickly and without much pushback from civil society. I mean, let's look at it. Clear away all the propaganda. We have a man in prison for next month for 4 years for exposing war crimes. Meanwhile, 20 years on from Iraq, not one of the prosecutors of that war in the US or the UK has faced a day in court. If you said that to someone who hadn't been deeply indoctrinated by the ferocious propaganda campaign against Assange for the last decade or so. That it sounds like something out of Orwell's 1984. It's madness, but that's where we are. And the judiciary, I mean, we started work at Declassified on the case in 2019, soon after he was evicted from the Ecuadorian embassy, or actually arrested forcibly by the British police. And most of the stuff we've done has been open source stuff. That's the other amazing thing about this case, is it's all there in plain sight, but no one touches it. So for example, the first big stories we did were about Lady Arbuthnot, who was the Westminster Chief Magistrate who made 2 crucial decisions against Assange in 2018. And her husband is Lord Arbuthnot, who is just a sort of, he's deeply embedded in the networks of power at the top of British society. He was a former Tory Defence Minister. He's on the boards of arms companies. He was appointed to the personal consultancy of the former head of MI6, Sir John Scarlett. So, I mean, he's deep in the whole thing. We did a couple of stories about that. I don't know if that's the reason, but she soon stepped aside on the case and was replaced by Baretza. That, again, another feature of this all is the secrecy around it. And then we've carried on doing more stories which have just exposed how politicized this prosecution is. I mean, and they don't try and hide it. That's the amazing thing. I don't know if people are aware that this memoir came out from a former minister called Alan Duncan. He was Minister for the Americas from 2016 to 19, and he released a memoir in 2001, I guess it was. 22, was it? 21, 2021 or 22? Oh, 2021, sorry, yeah. And that was like a kind of mini WikiLeaks in itself about what was happening in this case, but also in plenty of others. I've got plenty of other stories out of it. But it showed, I mean, it's so explicit and so blatant, and no one cares. He says after they persuaded Moreno to hand over Assange, he flew to Ecuador to hand him a plate from Buckingham Palace gift shop to say thank you for handing him over. That's a political prisoner. That's a political prisoner. He was given asylum by a friendly country, and asylum is a right enshrined in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Any normal law-abiding country would have allowed him safe passage out of the country. The UK did the opposite. So, I mean, we can go more if there's any specifics about the case, but there's just so much. I probably shouldn't bother going into it, but I think that what he exposed the British judiciary on a level I don't know if it's ever been exposed, and we don't know how it's going to end. They are destroying their reputation around the world, well, as much as it's covered by the media. But history will see it, that he's been stitched up completely. And not only at the behest of the British establishment, but the people that the British establishment ultimately work for, which is the American establishment. It's quite scary.
An interesting aspect of what we're talking about is this sort of revolving door / incestuous relationship, or we could say servile relationship that our media has vis-a-vis the security services. But of course, the first Director General of MI5, one of its founders, Vernon Kell, was actually, simultaneous to being an intelligence officer, the Daily Telegraph's correspondent in China. So it's not a new thing per se, but I guess that kind of leads us into the next question, which is, what were some of the things that WikiLeaks revealed, and what are the particular things that Julian is being punished for? And also, in addition to that, what were some of the publications that also published some of the things that WikiLeaks put out, who have had an interesting kind of trajectory with the case of Julian? Who are some of those publications, and also what were some of the things that they put out thanks to WikiLeaks?
Well, I think the publications for which Julian faces the rest of his life in prison, effectively a death sentence, a living death sentence, are precisely these publications from 2010. And they concern the Iraq and Afghan wars, the Guantanamo Bay detainee assessment briefs, the rules of engagement, which are the rules to kill, which were published alongside the collateral murder video, which is downstairs, of a helicopter opening fire on civilians,
including
yeah,
journalists from Reuters.
That's right, and children. And the State Department cables. And I think probably, well, first of all, those publications kind of blew the lid open on what was actually happening in Iraq and Afghanistan. And the Pentagon lost control of the narrative, which was very deeply controlled. So, for example, WikiLeaks revealed in detail incidents of IED deaths, not just deaths, but also people, injuries and so on, in such, high resolution detail that you had never seen a war in this kind of detail. And this is the detail with which the US military understands and analyzes the war. And that included 15,000 civilian deaths that they had been compiling, but had denied that they were compiling when they were in press conferences and so on. So they said they didn't know, but actually they did know. And of course they didn't disclose it because it made them look bad and because it didn't suit them politically, right? So that's why they were so angry, because all of a sudden what they had been actively concealing, but which was known to the Iraqi people because they buried their dead and cleaned up the blood off the streets, was now on record for everyone to see. And it was the US's own record, so they had been lying, right? The State Department cables are very interesting because they comprise, from I think 2004 to 2010, the detailed analysis and effectively contemporaneous history of every country where the US had diplomatic representation. Also those that it doesn't, right? Because it was also analyzing those areas where it didn't have diplomatic representation. And as such, it is the most valuable treasure trove for historians, academics, and so on to really understand what was going on in their own countries during those years. And so that's how you have such rich analyses continuing to be produced. The BBC had a radio program about 2 years ago about the assassination of Benazir Bhutto, which was really detailed because they had been mining the diplomatic cables about this assassination, and it won prizes and so on. So it's just kind of an open secret in the journalistic community for any investigative journalist that actually does their job seriously, that WikiLeaks is the go-to source for political, diplomatic, economic analysis, because there you have like the top diplomats of the United States making their analysis on countries and so on. And so any journalist worth their salt is going to go there and understand, to get a deep understanding of the true political situation of the country during that period. And obviously it's an ongoing resource because, politicians are around over time and these are issues that develop over decades and so on. Now, there's just no question that this is the most significant journalistic scoop in history. Like, it's unparalleled and it's continuing in its importance over time into the future. And of course, at the time, The Guardian, for example, won various prizes over their reporting based on these documents and so on. And you have to understand that when WikiLeaks broke onto the scene, there was a real crisis in the newsrooms. How do we sort out our economic model? Things are moving on to the internet, and they just couldn't pay for their staff journalists and so on. There comes WikiLeaks, purely reader-funded, a small group publishing on the internet and getting enormous attention, huge attention. Like, you know, everyone knew the name Julian Assange, but they couldn't name the editor of the New York Times. And this was a huge affront to their self-perception, their importance and position in the world. With the internet, they kind of lost their footing. They didn't know where they were going. And then WikiLeaks introduced these new methods of doing journalism. So the encrypted Dropbox, using encryption as a part of the process, a necessary part of the process. And secondly, introducing partnerships. And these two elements were completely new. Like, you know, he had huge pushback from all the partners for the fact of being partners. They wanted to be exclusive. But he forced the partnerships, and then he also tried to force encryption as the standard of communication. 10, 12 years on, this is basically what journalism has evolved into. But at the time, these two major innovations were so alien to the newsrooms that they insisted that Julian was something different. He's not us. And by kind of pushing this, he's not us, and he's also not, going to the same parties as the establishment and so on. They started believing their own propaganda to such an extent that they lost sight of what was going on. So the political attacks on Julian, they bought into, because it suited this "he's not us" narrative that they were pushing. And then finally, when the indictment came down against Julian, it came down, and well, the US government moved against Julian as a journalist. And this was entirely predictable. It was entirely predictable, except the egos and the analysis. There had been no analysis, I think, by these newsrooms about the possible attacks. And Julian knew from the beginning that the possible attack was going to be the Espionage Act. And the Espionage Act is worded so broadly that if you actually push the interpretation that the Trump administration finally pushed, it says that receiving information, possessing it and communicating it to an unauthorized person is a violation of the Espionage Act. And if you define journalism in these terms as receiving information, possessing it and communicating it to unauthorized persons, and being unauthorized to receive it, well, that's investigative journalism. That's always going to be national security journalism, right? Because if you're just looking for authorized leaks, we're talking about, well, not journalism as we understand it in any kind of free, independent media sense. We're thinking of, stenography. Yeah, right. So the media basically completely miscalculated in a really counterproductive and idiotic manner, because they believe their own propaganda. He's not us. So if the US moves against him, they'll move against him in some way that doesn't affect us. But actually, what he was doing was journalism from the start. That's all he was doing. And then when the US moved against him, they moved against him for doing journalism. They're not accusing him of being a source, a whistleblower, anything of that. They're accusing him of journalistic activity. So it's been slow, but the media has eventually caught on and sat down and done the legal analysis and understood that actually he is being accused of receiving information from a source, communicating it to the public, and that he conspired with the source to publish true information. I mean, this is a complete a complete changing of the relationship between the citizen and the state. You know, this is a massive shift. It's completely recalibrating the social contract you have over the citizen being able to have oversight over the state, which is supposed to be accountable to the public.
So your position as a legal expert is that what we're seeing is the re-engineering of the social contract, and the precedent that this case will represent will be wielded against other journalists. Is that what you...
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. But I also think that the way things have developed, I'm not sure that people who are maybe 20 today understand that there was a social contract. And there was that the expectation is that the press is supposed to be critical. The press is supposed to have the sufficient power to be able to basically overthrow a government if they have abused their power and violated that contract. And we've shifted over the past 10, 12 years into a new reality where the state is incredibly powerful, and it's not just the state, right? It has tentacles. It's not just a relationship between the citizen and the state, because the state itself is enmeshed with other corporate interests. And we have an increasingly powerful security and surveillance sector, which the state forms a part of, and which is, as it becomes more powerful, is also becoming more authoritarian and using the tools of the state to become more authoritarian, and of course then shut down the rights of the press, the rights of citizens, and behave precisely in the way that we're seeing against Julian.
So in a way, you have the war on terror representing a loss of civil liberties, the Magna Carta becoming an irrelevance when you look at somewhere like Guantanamo Bay, habeas corpus being suspended in particular states of exception. And then you also have this sort of dynamic between the state and the media really sort of being pummeled out. Like, so for instance, with the BBC, you know, the thing with the Iraq war particularly is that it split the British establishment massively. So you had situations like David Kelly, you had the BBC taking, you know, let's be clear, the BBC from the 30s was having MI5 vet its employees down to who worked in makeup, who worked in wardrobe. This was the reality of that corporation. But yet, what you also saw was little pieces of rebellion during the Iraq war, for example. So in a way, what's happened to Julian is kind of a continuation of the pummeling out of that relationship. What I'm also interested in asking you, Matt, is when you look at the Vietnam War, a feeling amongst many in the US military establishment is that part of the reason the US lost was because of the exposure of photographs from Vietnam. So that led to a few things. For instance, it informed the British government's decision not to allow any journalists to go to the Falklands during war. But what you also saw, and it's according to Yasha Levine in the book Surveillance Valley, he looks at a school of thought that existed within the US security state about the creation of the internet in the first place. And at the time when it was being initially worked on at universities like MIT, you had students going into occupation and on strike against the invention of the internet on the basis that it would equate to a massive violation of privacy. Right. So the US seeks ways to map out the world population, but also for purposes of counterinsurgency. This is Yasha Levine's conviction in the book. So the internet comes around. But what you also have then later on happening is a process whereby the internet is used to reveal the secrets of the powerful in a situation like the war on terror. Now, the attempts to paper over cracks in the monolith, which WikiLeaks was a massive crack in the monolith, is you know, and as you've said, Stella, that this process is in and of itself the punishment. You know, this is not, you know, leading up to the punishment. This is the punishment, as well as what they are hoping to do. But then, in the process of this surrounding of this isolating of Julian, you see UC Global, and then you see the revealing of the UC Global surveillance of Julian and yourself and others revealed in this Yahoo investigation. So what does this say really about the nature of power and the nakedness, actually, that it now is in a state of?
Yeah, I mean, the first point, which I think is important, is that any tool that comes along that allows people to spread information, to create networks outside of the power system, will eventually always be attacked by centers of power in our society. Those two centers of power, mainly the state and corporations. That is just a standard. And that's why a lot of technologists focus on ways that are foolproof, that can stand against state or corporate power trying to get into it. I mean, Bitcoin's quite an interesting example. One of its principles is that no state can attack it. It's a P2P system, which is secure. It's got no central node that can be attacked. I mean, that goes as well for information networks. So I think that we can always expect that to happen. I think the internet was a hugely liberatory thing. And we've seen, like you mentioned, just a massive attack on all its mechanisms for liberation and its subsumation into the system. And I think Assange will be seen as one of the major figures of the sort of crescendo of that freedom before the states finally crack down. And that's why it's so important he walks free, because if they get him, they won't stop. Another facet of power is that when they get new powers, they don't give them up. So the idea that they will get, if they get Assange to the States and bury him in Colorado for the rest of his, in a supermax in Colorado, that they'll just hang up their boots. That won't happen. They will use those new tools to attack more journalists. And the principle that will be established will be that the United States, the most powerful, the most violent state in the world, has the right to go to any country and pluck any citizen, because remember, Assange is not an American citizen, for alleged crimes that haven't even been committed in the United States. Because even if you accept the Trump administration's wacky theory that he committed a crime by releasing the cables, he didn't do that in the United States. He was in the UK and other places. So it gives extraterritorial reach to the United States to do basically whatever they want. And they won't give that up. So we cross the Rubicon if they get Assange. And I think that that's why it really goes to the heart of freedom, because this case is talked about in terms of press freedom. And that is obviously a fundamental tenet of our idea of freedom, but it impacts everything: free speech, our ability to organize, everything. Like, as Stella was talking about the legislation, the Espionage Act, which actually has never been used against a publisher before. The states understand that the internet and the mass diffusion of information by individuals on websites is a major threat to their possession of the narrative, and they're very, very scared by that. So they want to crack down on it. In the United States, they're using the Espionage Act. Here, there's a whole raft of legislation that's been touted that will do the same sort of thing. I don't know if anyone's come across the National Security Bill, which is going through Parliament now. That gives the right, the legislation gives if it passes, will give a potential 14-year sentence to a journalist who releases information that the government deems a threat to national security. And the provision is, and they've received funding at some point from a foreign government. But it's wild. I mean, stuff that you wouldn't think would even be contemplated 10 years ago. And but it will probably pass, and that's the thing, that they're just chipping away. And just to finish, a lot of this comes, I think, from lessons they learned from Iraq, which is what you're talking about. Because, as you said before, although the media has always been effectively acted as an arm of the state, it's been massively infiltrated, it's connected through various different mechanisms to state power and corporate power, there has been space for mavericks, there has been space for truthful information to get out. People like John Pilger, people like Seymour Hersh, in their heyday, they were writing front pages for the New York Times, for the Daily Mirror, for the Guardian. There's absolutely no way a young Seymour Hersh or young John Pilger starting out now would ever get a reporting job in a mainstream national newspaper in the UK or US. So there's been a massive contraction of the spectrum of opinion, and also just any kind of dissent. And that's quite interesting to me, because it's kind of contradictory in a way, because you would have thought when technology develops, which gives power to people in terms of opening up that space to bloggers or tweeters or whatever it is, you would have thought the pressure that would impose on the legacy institutions is they have to open up as well. But actually the opposite has happened. They've got more constricted. And I think that is because they learned a lesson from Iraq, because that was kind of the final splurge of dissent from mainstream media. Because especially the Daily Mirror, I don't know if people remember what the Daily Mirror was like in 2003, but I was, how old? 20. And it was astounding. I was buying the Daily Mirror every day. And Piers Morgan was the editor, but there were front pages where the headline was made out of oil companies' logos. They had Blair with blood all over his hands and Bush. I made stuff that this is one of the top selling newspapers. And I think, and as you mentioned, there was the David Kelly stuff in the BBC. And I think the powers that be were like, this is a real constraint, even though it wasn't it was like 10% of the media, but that was too much for them. And there was a concerted effort to squeeze out any kind of dissent from the mainstream, and it was successful. I mean, now the Guardian and the BBC are maybe the worst two in terms of just parroting the MOD line, and back in those days, they were maybe the best two. So you've seen a reversal. I don't think that's a coincidence. There's definitely some powers that have exerted their forces in some ways. So, yeah, I mean, I don't think... It swings and roundabouts, isn't it? I don't know where we go from here. If the government... the one thing that we have in our favour is norms. There is a societal norm that someone should not go to prison for journalism. That hasn't happened before Assange. Well, maybe Oscar, like for many, many generations. But I used to think that societal norms would have some kind of impact. But actually, with the Assange case, you've seen that they've managed to make the issue so toxic that the most people in the country don't even know that there's a journalist in Belmarsh maximum security prison. So it's probably not looking good for the future.
I mean, it's interesting when we look at sort of the trajectory of this, because with Collateral Murder, Julian was revealing violence against an Iraqi journalist, Reuters journalist. Then he became, and by doing that, a journalist that violence was directed against by the state. You have the exposure in Guantanamo Bay, for example, of the logs of prisoners that the US had, and it revealed that they had imprisoned people between the age of 13 to 14 years old in Guantanamo Bay. So this is a particular space of rightlessness that these people occupied, and then that same rightlessness came to Julian. And an interesting part of that story, I would say, is UC Global, because UC Global not only violated the rights of Julian, they violated the rights of yourself and your family. If you could just tell us a little bit about UC Global and their role in turning the Ecuadorian embassy into essentially a CIA black site.
Well, it's very interesting because whereas we, throughout the years, at times it's felt like you're fighting against some dark, undefined force, but actually the reality is that dark, undefined force is made up of individuals who are, just receiving a salary for doing a job, and perhaps because this case is so high profile and so significant and so controversial because of the intrinsics of it, because of what Julian has revealed, which is basically state criminality, and that he is a victim of the state. This other side of it has actually been able to come out in two respects. So UC Global was a security company who was actually physically inside the embassy. And it's a Spanish company, and Ecuador hired them because they didn't need visas to work in the UK, because at the time the UK was part of the EU. So you could have Spanish workers working inside the embassy because Ecuadorian security personnel would have to obtain a visa, and because of Julian's asylum, even diplomats were not obtaining visas to be able to come to the UK. So the way they solved that was having a Spanish company. Now, Julian always said, Spain is a NATO country, be careful, you know, and also the security industry there's a lot of security theater, and in order to keep contracts, they sometimes create their own threat model to justify extending the contract, and it's a very murky industry. So what you ended up with was a bunch of mercenaries, ex-mercenaries, ex-military, and some, you know, just regular guys who ended up in that embassy, and Spanish nationals. And when Pompeo came into the CIA, which was practically from the beginning of Trump's presidency, he immediately basically set the CIA on to bringing down WikiLeaks. And they secretly hired this UC Global to conduct surveillance and operations inside the embassy against Julian, his lawyers, myself, our child at the time, we just had one, and so on. And that involved putting hidden microphones in the meeting room where there was a fire extinguisher, so they had a magnetic contraption that would stick under the microphone. They would offload the recordings every 12 hours. They installed cameras with audio recordings, but that was concealed. And every 2 weeks, they would physically transport those hard drives to the US. How do I know so much detail? Because UC Global workers, when Julian was arrested, were disgusted that they had been part of that. And they then went to El País, and they went to Spanish police and prosecutors with evidence, including some of those very hard drives that they had in their possession, to demonstrate, to evidence what had been going on. And then the CEO of the company was then raided by Spanish police, and they found 2 guns with the serial numbers filed off, and now there's a court case against that guy in Spain, and there's a lot more there that they managed to seize through these raids and so on. The other part of this is that then in the US, where the operational end of it was occurring, there were also whistleblowers, sources who were willing to talk about it because they were also disgusted. And that came out in this Yahoo News investigative unit article, which came out, I think, about a year and a half now ago, where they described the planning of that operation, that UC Global operation. So that Pompeo, when he came in, he had discussions with Trump in the White House about, well, we should kill Assange, and that as CIA director, he asked his CIA underlings to develop what were called sketches and plans about how they would go about assassinating Julian. And this was mirrored in what the UC Global had been talking about, how to poison him, that maybe they could leave the door open so that Julian could be kidnapped, and then there would be deniability, that, oh, they were in the toilet and it just happened and the door just didn't close well, and so on. So this is incredible. You have the planning of it exposed in this expose by this Yahoo News investigative unit. You have the operational, like those people who were actually carrying out these plans, including like recording Julian's legally privileged meetings with his lawyers about the defense strategy in a possible extradition hearing. And then subsequently, Ecuador shipped off all his legal archive, all his legal advice from the embassy, which was seized, and they shipped it off to the US. And there's such rich detail. And when I read about Julian's case in the press here, it's just like, how can they not, you could not wish for a more intriguing, rich, detailed case than this. And yet, it's really just kind of skimmed over and not properly understood. Because if it were properly understood, it would be the subject of constant analysis. And then, well, I mean, apart from some work that is happening, but I'm talking about, like, if the original 5 partners, The Guardian, New York Times, Der Spiegel, and so on, actually combined their resources to speak to their sources and like get to the bottom of this and really come to terms with it, then Julian wouldn't be in prison. But we're still with this kind of half, they're on the right side of history, they're against the prosecution, they've put out a joint statement, great. But come on, like, we're beyond that. He's been in prison for 4 years. He's facing the rest of his life in prison. How long can he, just fight to survive? And there has to be some more meaningful and, in-depth coming to grips with what's going on, because now there's so much out there on the public record.
Absolutely. And how did you first become aware of what was happening in the embassy? Because that story in and of itself is quite interesting.
Well, just a sliver of it. I first of all realized that the people working in the embassy were working against Julian, because attention on what was happening inside the embassy, who was visiting Julian, and Julian's every movement became very apparent that was their primary focus, and they barely looked at the security cameras outside. I mean, I remember many instances where I was like, have you seen this person outside? This looks like they're doing something strange. Like, have you realized? And they just weren't looking at the external cameras anymore. And so it was in December 2017, there was a opening that Julian would perhaps be able to leave the embassy in a perfectly legal manner if all those involved had actually respected the international conventions they had signed on to, that Julian was actually given diplomatic status by Ecuador, and that was notified to the Foreign Office, and the Foreign Office refused to acknowledge that status, even though theoretically they were not in a position to do so. And they said they would arrest him anyway. But it was during that period that things got really tense inside the embassy. And one of the workers followed me out of the embassy when I went to buy some lunch at Tesco's or something. And he took me aside and he said, we're being asked to do some very strange things. And one of the things they've asked me to do is to retrieve a nappy of the baby that comes in with you sometimes, and you, you shouldn't, just don't bring the baby in anymore. And I tried to get more information out of him because, you know, I really wanted to understand what these strange things were beyond what he was telling me. And I asked him, well, why do they want the nappy and so on? And he didn't want to tell me anything more. He just said, well, he did say that they were speaking to the CIA at the time, and that he was getting these strange instructions. And I tried to say, you know, can you give me more information? Can you give me evidence that you're speaking to the CIA? And he was like, no, I'm just telling you because you shouldn't bring the baby in anymore. And then we didn't hear anything more. I mean, obviously, we were really on our guard already, but after that, and I didn't really see that guy again afterwards. And then, you know, after Julian was arrested, then there were several whistleblowers from UC Global that then came out. Well, they're protected witnesses actually, but they went to the authorities to disclose what they had been doing, including this detail that I found out about in December 2017, but then was put in, you know, in a sworn affidavit by one of the protected witnesses.
And if you can confirm what it seems like the point was in stealing the nappy of a baby.
Well, it was clearly to establish that the baby was Julian's. And this was precisely at the time when there were these assassination and kidnap plots that were, you know, that were being planned out, plotted out, and there were it was confirmed at the time that Julian, you know, that they were ready to get Julian, and there was a snatch team outside, and Ecuador was trying to pressure Julian into leaving, and so on. So it was clear to me that they were trying to establish that we were a family, and that obviously me and our baby were kind of the easy targets in order to get Julian, right? That's one way of trying to coerce a person, targeting their family. And I was followed, and my mom was followed, and all these things. But I think it went much further than that. That there were clearly a range of plans that were being explored, and I can't assert with certainty that there were plans to physically harm us, but that's definitely how it felt, like that we were at risk, that Julian was definitely at risk, that anything could happen inside the embassy, that he could be killed, and that there would be nothing we could do about it.
And, you know, what you alluded to was the Yahoo investigation, which drew on the testimony of 30 employees of the US National Security State. And what it revealed was that the US were hatching these plans, and even at one point said that the British could do the shooting if there was any attempt to stop this happening. And imagine the only branch of the BBC that actually covered this story was BBC Somalia. All of the other branches of the BBC completely ignored that this story existed. Can you just tell us a little bit more about what that plan, or what those plans looked like? What kind of things were considered as options on the table?
Well, the Yahoo News story talks about entering the embassy and kidnapping Julian in this deniable way, which was actually exactly what the UC Global workers had already mentioned previously in their sworn statement, so it was a clear mirror. The US had discussed abducting Julian and conducting an extraordinary rendition from the UK. This is like war on terror tactics, right? And taking him potentially to a black site. And this Yahoo News story is very interesting because it really establishes the timeline. Julian wasn't indicted until March 2018, and these plans were in 2017. So you have the US basically planning to abduct someone from the UK, or from their diplomatically protected, internationally protected status as a political refugee inside a diplomatic mission. So there's a double layer of international protection theoretically. And from the UK to a black site. And then these things were being discussed at the National Security Council, which is a combination in the US of, you know, people in the CIA and the other intelligence agencies and the Department of Justice and the White House and so on. And then, according to this article, it entered into some, like, it posed a problem for the US because the DOJ said, well, we don't have a case against Assange. What are you going to do? So you're going to abduct him on what grounds? And so then the pressure started to actually lay charges on Julian and indict him. So that's like the clear origins of this case is a political case. Of course, you have the CIA planning to kidnap and assassinate him or abduct him, and so he's in US custody, but you have to justify that somehow. So then the DOJ had pressure to then indict him, and indicted him in this really, really insane indictment. I mean, when you look at it and you really see it for what it is, like the Espionage Act is applied extraterritorially against a foreigner for publishing true information that was of the utmost importance to the public, you know, criminalizing routine journalistic activity, and trying to protect, or he's accused of trying to help Chelsea Manning conceal her identity. So this case was really forced through because in the context of this CIA plan under Pompeo, who was completely obsessed with bringing WikiLeaks down, and that was partly because WikiLeaks had also during the Trump presidency made a major publication on the CIA and its tools to basically take over your phone and use exploits, use vulnerabilities in operational systems on phones and TVs and so on to be able to take over those phones, TVs, cars, and, well, do what they do.
And that was during Pompeo's time that some of that was being developed, right?
Absolutely. And the reason why the Yahoo News story was so rich and had so many sources was because this was Pompeo gone rogue. Pompeo, using the war on terror tactics against a publisher, and that was too far even for people within the national security establishment who engage in some pretty hairy operations as it is, but it was too far even for people within the U.S. National Security Council and establishment, and that's why Julian's still alive. But that doesn't mean they didn't carry out those operations to a significant extent. They did abduct him. They did put him in prison arbitrarily, ongoingly in this outrageous case where he is a political prisoner.
So just for the last question, the way I understand what WikiLeaks did was a public service to billions of people across the world, whether it was information about what oil companies were doing in the global south. You know, there is a clear understanding among millions of people across the world of which side they are on and which side Julian is on. If you could speak to, you know, it's a question that I have put to John, his father. What can you say about this connection that people around the world have with the case of Julian Assange? What do they see in the case of WikiLeaks, would you say?
Well, I think what Julian has provided with WikiLeaks is a contribution worldwide to our kind of shared social contract, and shared social contract for a continued and improved relationship with power. That's why it resonates so much, because it mapped out power, it mapped out victimhood, it mapped out where the fault lines are, and basically put democratic accountability to the test. And that it's failed dismally, because there has been no accountability. There was an acknowledgement of the importance of these publications. There's an acknowledgement of war crimes, of evidence of crimes against humanity, and so on. And then nothing happened. And what happened was a vicious attack on Julian. And so you have, I think, what you have with the understanding of this case around the world, you have it in countries that have a history or I think a recent and very palpable history of repression, of authoritarian governments, of political cases, of political prisoners. They get it in an instant. They recognize it instinctively. Here, I think over time people also recognize it instinctively, because they understand you can't just have someone in prison endlessly. He's not, you know, you have violent criminals who are in prison for far less than Julian has been in prison, and they understand there's some kind of power abuse element that's going on. They understand that they don't need to know the detail of the case to be right about that. But I do think that, you know, people who have been in a position of victimhood and the victims of some arbitrary abuse of the state, they recognize themselves in Julian immediately, and many of them also understand that he exposed that very abuse.
Thank you very much, Stella and Matt. We are now going to take some questions from the floor. So we have George here with a microphone who will be able to take questions from people on the floor. So if you have anything that you would like to ask Matt for the moment, or myself, please go ahead. Stella will be back momentarily.
I might as well start my name. Matt, it's nice to actually see you work in real life. Right, my question is this. I'm always thinking about accountability when it comes to the security state. And is there any accountability for MI5? And at a percentage from 1% to 100%, how much power does the security state control in this country?
That's a very good question. And actually, I've done a lot of work on this, so I think I can give a relatively informed answer to that. In terms of accountability, MI5 and MI6, there's effectively zero. They are completely secret. There's two bits of legislation which apply to them, which mean you can get information from them. One is the Environmental Information Legislation of 2004. It was a Blair piece of legislation which meant that any public body had to give over their environmental reports. So that's number one. Number two is the privacy. It's actually an EU thing, but it's been converted into UK law, or is being converted into UK law, and that's when you can request any public institution information they have on you. But, so I've tried to use both those bits of legislation with MI5 and MI6, and there's been no, they don't give it. So they don't even apply the two bits of legislation which they're obliged to. Apart from that, there's the committee in Parliament, which was created in the 90s as a kind of, when the intelligence agencies took on statutory basis. But again, they're kind of captured by the intelligence agencies themselves. So yes, it's a scary thing actually. And they tell you that secrecy is about protecting you, but it's actually about protecting them from any accountability. There's obviously the nature of intelligence work. There is an element of secrecy that needs to happen if you're working on disrupting terrorist attacks and stuff like that. But huge amounts of it is just because they know that it's much easier to operate and do their work without.
They're basically a rogue group.
They are. And also they're an arm of the British establishment. That's what people don't understand. They're kind of like a secret enforcement arm. MI6, for example, are tasked with doing all sorts of state policy operations that are political operations. So, for example, the famous one is when they overthrew Iranian democracy in 1953 because the Democratic Prime Minister nationalized the oil company. But that's carried on. And a good example recently about the secrecy around MI6 and MI5 is the Manchester bombing in 2017, which was an awful terrorist attack, the worst terrorist attack in modern British history. And the terrorist who did it was saved from Libya by the British Navy. And he was going in and out of the UK the whole time to Libya to fight because it was in our interest to overthrow Gaddafi. And in that inquiry, all the evidence that MI5 and MI6 gave was behind closed doors. So we don't know it. So there's no accountability at all. And that is because the nature of what they do is very different to how they're presented. I've just finished with GCHQ, which is obviously the other main intelligence agency and actually the largest by quite a distance, much bigger than MI5 and MI6. GCHQ, ironically, is a bit more open. They have a press department, for example, so you can email them. I actually got, I mentioned that privacy legislation. I did get information they have on me, or the bit they have on me, from their press department, and it showed that they'd blacklisted me after I did a story about their program in schools. They're working in schools and taking in arms companies. So, but again, there's a whole operational level of GCHQ, which I'm sure has other information on me and everyone else that they won't give you. So it's a completely secret part of the British state, and it's very, very carefully curated, the public image. So we're fed all this rubbish about James Bond and all the rest of it. But it is funny, but it is a very, very clever way of making what are essentially highly repressive, highly political institutions seem nice and cuddly to the public. GCHQ do all these crosswords. I don't know if you see on Twitter and stuff. GCHQ has been found by the EU to have been illegal mass surveillance. They're also involved in every single war that Britain fights, and the US. So, yeah, one of my main goals in life is to try and raise awareness of what these institutions get up to, but no one.
So percentage-wise, their power.
Their power within the British state. 20%, because you've got the military.
Okay, do we have any questions for Matt or Stella from the audience? We have someone at the back.
I have a question for all of you. What is the next action? Because this is a political case. Julian Assange can never go to the United States, and we are many. The oppressors are few. What is the next action that we come to the streets? But only the pressure can put this government down and think. But a lot of pressure, writing, calling to the government, not only, and also to this MI5, MI6, and GCQ, this CIA, they are criminal organizations. They want to hide the face of Julian. They will never can hide the face of Julian. Julian go with us all over the world. There are many people in many countries, even in Colombia, and they are fighting for Julian, because we know if they punish Julian, they are punish all of us. Then I am asking is, what is the next action? And only I would like to let you know, Chakama, CIA said Chakama only can come back in a coffin to United Kingdom. We were a few people in front of this parliament, and we got Chakama alive, but we wrote letters like the MPs used to come and say, you are flooding our boxes with letters. We called them. We protested in the streets. We went to the CIA, to MI5, MI6 with our uniforms. We need to take action. Action. We are many, the oppressors are few. Julian will be free. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So I think that question would be best answered by Stella. What's next?
Thank you. Well, all the protests that you do are hugely significant. It's really important for them to see that Julian has such strong and dedicated and persistent support throughout the years that grows and grows. I think what you say is so true, that they're very powerful, but their power disappears very quickly. I mean, you just have to look at Pompeo, who just wrote a book, and his own PAC purchased, I don't know if it was 3,000 or 30,000 copies in order to get him on the New York Times bestseller list. No one else bought it except for some of our lawyers, perhaps. This guy who had the power to order assassinations and so on, in reality, once the power is gone, it's gone. And the power of ordinary people to shape opinion, to show courage, to show they believe in something, which is a lot more powerful than what politicians have, right? Most people are not, the media side, are not sycophantic to power like that. You know, they're critical of how the powerful abuse their position and cynically use their means to advance other interests and so on. But Julian's support is resilient and strong, and we've seen this over the years. It's just built, you know. Julian's brother and father are in the United States right now with Ithaca, and I think so far they have 59 different locations. They're about halfway through, and new screenings keep on popping up, and it's in random locations, you know.
That's more than Pompeo's book tour, I'm sure.
Oh, for sure. And they're filling cinemas, and they're really moving people. moving people to see things differently, to understand the case for what it is, to undo a lot of the propaganda by just showing the reality. And I think people instinctively understand once they see reality and they contrast it with the propaganda, they can see what's real and what isn't. And you just have to find the ways to break through that that kind of wall that has been elevated to like shape opinion. And we had that for a while, for Julian in especially 2016, 2017, 2018, leading up to his arrest. Julian was gagged from March 2018 by the Ecuadorian embassy. They didn't allow him to speak anymore and didn't allow him to tweet. That kind of prepared the ground for attacks in the media where he couldn't counter. He couldn't give interviews, he couldn't write pieces because Ecuador was threatening to evict him and so on. But we've, because of the growing awareness about this injustice, because people are mobilizing, because people are disgusted, we've pierced all that propaganda. Like, people don't believe it anymore. And they see the reality of the situation. And that's why, the film Ithaca, which is probably is going to show in more places here, and I can't say more about that, but probably for a broad audience. That's why there's an interest and an appeal for that, because it's a completely different perspective on this. And because the propaganda that was being pushed has become ineffective, because it's not persuasive anymore, right? When they were 2010, 2011, the way that the story was being told, it stopped working certainly by the time Julian was arrested. All of a sudden it was like, the US actually wants him extradited. Hold on. For years they've been saying he was paranoid and they didn't want him and there was nothing there. So that kind of started falling apart. And I think things like this exhibition, for example, is so important, and cultural expressions that allude to Julian's case. It's not even, Julian pops up just here and there. The other day, Russell Brand was in the US and he was on some talk show, and then he just reached out, he was just trying to make a point, and he said Snowden and Assange. And those are his reference points. And I think that's become a thing. These are the reference points for the public about people who told the truth and who have suffered the consequences unjustly. And that is a cultural reference now, and that can't be taken away. And that's something to build on. And I think the power of culture and of art is so important. It's so important, and it's something that was instilled with me from an early age. My parents are both artists, and they were involved in the anti-apartheid struggle, and we were living in Botswana at the time with a lot of exiled South African artists and activists coming out of South Africa, fleeing South Africa in the 80s, and they conceptualized themselves as cultural workers for a free South Africa. And they produced, posters and plays and photography and films because they saw the power of culture to kind of pierce the wall of propaganda. And it's incredibly powerful, but it's also necessary in order to change a situation, because the establishment is like, it's like weirdly affected by culture. Like, so the artists are saying this. They can't control the artists. They can't control art. They can't control public opinion. And also art and culture is dynamic and creative and innovative and transgressive, and they just can't manipulate it. So that's, I think there's huge reason to be, I don't want to use hopeful, but like, we're making progress and we can free Julian, you know, and it has to be on every level. It has to be speaking to the conservative politicians, speaking to the labor politicians, the people on the ground, on the streets, the artists, you know, the academics, the journalists, everyone. They have to come together because this is just so important. This isn't just about Julian. It is about Julian. But it's about all of us, yeah.
George, I think we've got another question at the back.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for the panel this evening. It was very informative. Thank you for your time. I just have a question for Stella. Stella, we have the case of Edward Snowden, who sought political asylum in Russia. My question to you is, what made you choose the Ecuadorian embassy for Julian? Or what made Julian choose the Ecuadorian embassy? Thank you.
Well, Julian, he had asked for the Australian embassy to make a series of representations to both Sweden and the United States in, I think it was May 2012. And the Australian government, and these were urgent representations that needed to be made about a guarantee from Sweden, for example, not to extradite Julian to the United States. And the Australian government failed to act. At the same time, Julian was at the time trying to appeal, or he was preparing to appeal to the European Court of Human Rights. And Sweden applied for the time period for him to be able to appeal to go from 2 weeks to 0, and for him to go into prison, remand prison immediately. And this was communicated to his solicitor. And so it was clear that his window of opportunity to actually seek asylum was extremely narrow. And so Ecuador was actually a country that had said publicly when the Ecuadorian cables were published, the foreign minister, no, before Patiño. No. This was 2011. Anyway, had suggested that Julian could get asylum in Ecuador. And so Ecuador, which was at the time had just closed the biggest naval base of the US in Latin America, and had said, you can have a base here if we can have a base in Miami. The political position of the Correa government meant that Julian thought that probably Ecuador was a country that might protect him. So he applied for asylum in the Ecuadorian embassy and obtained it 2 months later after they had studied his case. And they gave it to him on the basis, partly because the UN Special Rapporteur on Torture at the time had examined Chelsea Manning's case and said that she had been subjected to torture by the US military. And of course, Chelsea Manning is the co-accused in relation to this case. And then also Ecuador had also made the representations that Julian had initially sought from Australia to ask Sweden whether they agreed not to extradite Julian further to the US if he went there. Sweden refused to answer. Similarly to the UK, and also the US was asked whether they were looking to prosecute Julian. And they basically hit a brick wall. And after there was no answer from either of the UK, Sweden, or the US, Ecuador stepped in because they saw there was evidence of risk of persecution and torture in this case in relation to a publisher and the Chelsea Manning background and so on. They granted him political asylum, rightly so.
This question is for Stella. So I know Julian's got a lot of supporters in different industries. You mentioned before artists, journalists, academics, celebrities, lawyers. I think Julian still has and did have a large support group within the security community. And by that I mean some within the ethical security community. Of course, he came from a background when he was much younger. And I think he's, as you described, a brilliant man with a lot of technical competency. And I think that maybe introduced him somewhat as maybe a threat when he became a journalist, because I think to some degree that made him very effective at being a journalist. He had a lot of support in the past from the security community, for example, with WikiLeaks, with the big banking blockade, with very potent activist involvements. Do you think, well, I think that in the past was primarily because people were angry. And I think I might speculate that perhaps some people within the security community that are supportive of Julian may be angry now, or maybe becoming angry because of the circumstances surrounding him. Do you think that their involvement in supporting him could be helpful again, or could introduce problems? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think Julian you're right, he has a lot of support, also within the InfoSec community. And I think Julian needs support from every sector, and there have been a lot of people who have come forward, and probably within that community, people are especially educated on what the stakes are and what it all means and what's been going on. So I have said in the past, and I say it again, that anyone who has information about the abuses and criminality that has been going on in order to persecute and arbitrarily detain Julian and try to assassinate him should step forward in a secure fashion and say what they know, give evidence of the criminality involved, because that can set Julian free.
Absolutely.
Yeah, thank you to everyone who's helped to organize this event and who's participated in it. Two quick points before I ask my question. Just to note that Snowden only applied for asylum in Russia after the US government yanked his passport while he was transiting through Moscow airport. So the American government deliberately stuck him in Russia, and that left him with no choice other than to claim asylum because he had no visa to stay there in perpetuity. So just that's something that I think is worth noting. Also, on the national security bill, I wrote a detailed piece for Consortium News. That's life in prison that journalists face if they get caught, or anybody faces if they violate Section 1 rather than 14 years. And it has passed the House of Lords last week, And they made it even worse than when I wrote about it last year. They've added an entire section about foreign interference. So it's just, I think people should look into that because it's a very frightening bill. It's even more frightening than the Espionage Act, and applies to anybody anywhere in the world as well. So my question is more practical. What's the latest in relation to the appeal that's going on? I'm sorry if you answered that when I was downstairs in the loo. But if you haven't, what's going on? Is there any news in relation to the High Court case, or?
There is no news. The status is the same as it's been for about, over 6 months now. Julian has applied or sought permission to appeal to the High Court. It's not an automatic appeal. The High Court has to examine the grounds and then pick and choose what grounds it wants to hear, if any. So there is the possibility that the High Court could say we don't want to hear any of these grounds, and in which case then Julian is at severe risk of being extradited within a matter of weeks, if not days. I mean, so we're, in this kind of uncertainty at the moment. The grounds that have been presented, we say, are extremely important and crucial about press freedom and due process, and incorporate the recent, the information that has come out since the previous extradition hearing about Pompeo's plans to kidnap and assassinate him, which alone should just throw out the case, right? But we're waiting to hear how the High Court deals with this case, and if it will give leave to appeal, and it could come down any day, and we're expecting it any day, really. But there's no deadline per se, but we are expecting it soon because it's been such a long time.
What about the International Criminal Court? This cannot end here. We need to look into international institutions, or they are the board for the United States. Yeah. International Criminal Court.
Well, the European Court of Human Rights would be the court that would be the next stage after the UK courts. And we have to exhaust the domestic remedies first. So it's still in the UK court system until they have finished hearing all appeals.
Excuse me, sorry. Being a legal expert, please feel free to correct me, but the UK doesn't extradite to countries that still have the death penalty. Is that correct?
Not exactly. They do extradite to the United States, which has the death penalty. What they do is they have this agreement with the United States that if they extradite someone, then the US will not apply the death penalty, even if it is a death penalty case. So they'll use a lesser penalty. But I mean, in Julian's case, he faces 175 years. I mean, it's a death penalty. Yeah, it's keeping him in prison until he dies. So the UK does allow that, and it does extradite people to spend the rest of their lives in a hellhole in a US prison. And the US prison system, I don't think we see much about it so much anymore. I remember a few years ago, I mean, when I was at university, there was a lot of talk about US prisons and the US prison system being barbaric. And the stats say that on any given day, there are 80,000, that's 80,000 people in solitary confinement in the United States. Of course, they don't call it solitary confinement, but it is 24/7 inside a prison cell on your own without any contact with anyone else. That's solitary confinement, and fitting that definition, not whatever rubric they give it, 80,000 people on any given day are in those conditions. And so that's routine. That's how US prison systems deal with prisoners. And, you know, there has been some like technicalities around Julian's conditions in the United States. The United States says that if it considers it appropriate, they will put Julian in solitary confinement. And they can say that there are national security grounds because this is a national security case. So they have all the administrative facilities to do so. The United Kingdom, the High Court in the previous appeal when the US appealed and the courts agreed to the US arguments, went along with it, and they said, well, it's perfectly permissible for the US to put him in solitary confinement. I mean, the US issued what it said was assurances, but they don't describe at all what the US did. They sent a letter which basically licensed the US to put Julian in solitary confinement. It didn't restrict the US. It said that the US reserved the power to put him in solitary confinement. And it is atrocious that the high courts allowed that to overturn the previous decision, because it didn't restrict the US's powers, it licensed them.
Thank you very much to Stella Assange, to Matt Kennard. Please keep in touch with the campaign, get involved, and let's do this. Thank you to the audience.